My name's Paula Hill, and a couple of things I wanted to say is, first of all, responding to what Roz said, there was a debate about 10 years ago on television about Colston, and the guy there suggested we might have red plaques in place of the blue plaques we normally have to commemorate people, and these were to commemorate especially evil people. So then we wouldn't be, in fact, ignoring the legacy of Colston, we'd just be putting it in its appropriate context. So I fully support having red plaques next to the statue of Colston. And the other point I'd like to make is that I'm very sorry, the woman in the blue cardigan, it was, you were discussing how Colston had somehow a contradiction in his personality and was benefiting from the slave trade and at the same time funding projects here in Bristol for the working classes. But that sort of contradiction is quite common in human nature. Many people support their own family before others. Hitler was very kind to some German youths at the expense of many Jewish people. I don't think you can really say that that leaves a personality imbalance. Surely the horrors in which he were involved in no way mitigates, the philanthropy here in Bristol in no way mitigates the fact that he was raising money from extreme horrors of other people. And I totally support Roz in let's get rid of his name from the Colston Hall, because as long as you have somebody's name on something, it stands as a monument to them, and people will naturally assume that we think that person has done some great good. So yes, let's not forget him. Let's just put him in appropriate context, is what I would say.
Does anyone want to take an alternative view by any chance?
I used to be a researcher at the Commonwealth Museum, and I spent 10 years after I arrived here looking at Colston. Why do you say that Colston made his money from being member of the African Company? Why do you say that? Do you know how much money he actually made? The only way you could make money out of the African Company, it was a stock company. The only way you could make money was out of your annual dividends. But they couldn't pay a dividend in those days. They weren't doing very well. And in the 11 years he was a member, he received precisely £708. He gave the City of London in 1709, when there was a famine, used for all the people in London, £20,000. That didn't come from his £708 that he'd met when he was a member of the African Company. It's been suggested that he got his money from St. Kitts. Now, you may remember from your historical that St. Kitts, in his time, was shared with the French, and the French frequently ravaged it and ruined the plantations. The only way he could have made money from sugar was by bringing sugar into this country, either into London or into Bristol. And if you look at the port books, all right, there are gaps in the port book, but you can get enough from the port books to see that there wasn't sugar coming from St. Kitts. From he lived in London, but basically his family was based in Bristol, and his father and his brother had an interest in a small sugar refinery. And when his father and his brother died, he inherited it. But he shared it, remember he was a Tory, he shared it with the local Whig MP, Sir Thomas Day. And if you look at the records looked at by the Gloucester Archaeological Society in the 1920s, during that period, Colston merely sat in the background. He might have got a small amount of money for that, but basically the money went to the other members. And if you look at when he started giving money to the various charities that he was interested in, that came towards the end of his time in the Royal African Company. He'd finally risen to be deputy governor. At that time, we had the Glorious Revolution when King William III came to the throne. And Colston transferred £1,000 of his stock to King William so that King William could become the supreme governor. And King William was, for the next 11 years, the supreme governor of the Royal African Company. Now we have his statue sitting in Queen Square. Should we consider that his statue should equally be removed just as much as Colston? He had as much interest in the African trade at that time. In fact, he went one further. The Royal African trade functioned through a royal prerogative granted by the king, the previous king. What did King William do? Right, we now had a parliamentary government as a result of the Glorious Revolution. But in conjunction with Parliament, William revoked that royal prerogative, throwing open the trade to everybody in the country. And what was the result? British ships started to carry far more slaves to the West Indies. So perhaps he is as bad a character as Colston as far as that's concerned. I tend to have an awareness of this because I learnt from my father, who went out to Africa and worked in Nigeria for 10 years from the 1890s. And therefore history is a more immediate thing for me than you. My grandfather was a Georgian, born just after the Battle of Waterloo, victim of the Highland clearances, which is why my father had to go to Africa to find a job, because he couldn't find one in Scotland. But in that time, when he was in Africa in the 1890s, slavery still existed, both domestic and chattel. I know there are suggestions that it was only domestic in Africa, but there was chattel as well. So when I came to Bristol and started helping at the Commonwealth Museum, I could never find evidence that Colston made more than the money that I've indicated. So he had very little money. His money came because he basically was a Levant trader. He got it from trading in fabrics, trading in oil, trading in... Now, when we come back to the trade that you could only trade in Africa because of the...
Okay. I think we've probably got enough.
Right.
Yes, thank you very much.
Yeah. Okay, we've got three hands.
Right,
yeah.
we've got several hands going, yes.
Yeah.
So why don't we... The lady at the back there, do we have a hand up here?
Hi, I'm Shabana. So I think what's really interesting when we talk about slavery is we tend to talk about the importance of history and recognizing history and how it, how it shapes society today. But actually what I tend to find is we get fixated on history. We tend to, and it ends up being, who was worse, Africans were involved in slave trade, Colston was this. Actually, what I think we need to do is when we talk about slavery, we need to talk about today. How is it actually impacting our relationship today? And in a way, that's the best thing in terms of understanding our history. It's not about the past, it's about today. The fact is, a lot of black people, and not just black people, I'm saying South Asian because I'm part of the colonized, we are affected by slavery, we are affected by colonization, and it's really important that when we have conversations, it goes beyond the academic, it actually goes into the real world. The fact that, black people lighten their skin, black women relax their hair, the fact that my name's Shabana, but people say, can I call you Sophie because I can't pronounce your name? These are all real issues, and I think it's really important that we address these issues today and actually make history come more alive in order to understand ourselves and each other. I suppose I did history for as long as I can remember, and I just kind of feel that the voice of the marginalised communities are always exempt from history, and I just think let's actually broaden our definition of history and make it more relevant to today so we can move on. Let's address the inequalities that exist today so that we can accept that slavery was a shit thing that happened, but actually it's about looking forward. But we can't do that unless we make it relevant to today and look at the social issues that exist today. So that was a bit rambly, sorry, but that's my point.
Thank you very much. There's a lady over there, I think.
I just wanted to say thank you for what you said earlier. It's interesting to come to a talk like this because I'm interested in continuing the conversation. But what I find when we continue the conversation is that continuing to look back. And one way that I think it would be really lovely to celebrate is to make a monument for important black figures to inspire us. So when I look back, I don't look back at a heritage that was enslaved. I look back at people that I can be proud of, and I look back at people who are really, really strong. So I'd like to hear more of that kind of stuff in these discussions.
Great. Okay. The gentleman just in front, if you could stand up. Thank you very much. Identify yourself.
I must admit, I don't feel a great apology for looking back. And the reason being that I think when we talked about memory, when we talked about heritage, we're also talking about identity. We're talking about our collective identity. We're talking about how we're layered as people and we're built upon the memories of who our ancestors were, who our forefathers, who our grandparents are. And that's an important part of our personal narrative, our personal sense of self, whether we want to own that narrative or disavow it. And I think, in a sense, maybe the question really isn't about Colston and Colston Hall, but only for this reason, that the city is marked and deeply seeped in the the heritage of slavery. And that there are many other slaves, as Madge knows, whose names are still across the city. And so the changing of one place or the focus upon one figure doesn't really address that. And in a sense, what I would suggest is that really what we're talking about is something perhaps quite fundamental and quite radical, and which goes beyond actually just talking about the experience and the relationship with people of African descent, but also about class too. And it's about what is our sense of identity as a Bristol, as a city. And that sense of identity owns also to fracture and also talks about, in a sense, that this is a history of dissonance, this is a history of class and racial divide. And so looking forward, but also looking back, is to own that too, and to move away from these comfortable narratives that wasn't it so great, and then denying these other aspects, but also moving away from just pinpointing one facet of it. So we're talking about really readdressing what is the identity of our city. And in a sense, I'd just like to, in this kind of garbled way that I've said this, introduce as a point perhaps to pick up by the panel. Thank you.
The gentleman there with his hand up.
Professor Dresser said, Madge Dresser said, we should embrace the contradiction. I don't think that's the good position. It's like a poisoned pill, a sugared poisoned pill. On one hand, the precedents are good, but on the other hand, do they really address the bad part of the poisoned pill in any subject? We're going forward with Bristol, not just past. Does the sweetness of one thing balance the bad of the poison pill? Hold on, Madge. I'll finish. So, what's needed is a change of thinking. Look at the sweet bit and say, does that contain an antidote to the bad bit? Now, modest request: a statue and a renaming of Causton Hall. That's nowhere near enough, right? What do? Okay, we do that, we win that round, move on. That's not good enough. That way of thinking about things is still very present in Bristol today, very present in the world today. There's going to be more slavery in the years to come. Believe me, there's going to be lots of it. So we need a change of thinking. To quote Einstein, you can't cure the problem of the past, the ones that created the problem, by the same level of thinking. We need a new way of thinking. And that new way of thinking is the big memorial. And I would suggest the poem you said and the song you sung would fit well into it would be the sweetness and a different way of thinking in Causton Hall. In fact, it would go very well in Causton Hall because it was Causton Hall and still named Causton Hall. The stuff that goes on in Causton Hall could well be a sort of representative of a different way of thinking. And that's what we do. We don't want to move on. We want to find another way of thinking about these things. And I've suggested this way. Contrast the poison pill with the sugar coating and say, does the sugar contain, appropriate enough sugar, does it contain enough of an antidote to balance the poison part of the bad ways of thinking?
Okay. Right.
This gentleman here.
Professor Horton, you must kind of sense that I'm an anthropology student, actually. I'm a PhD student in the department at the University of Edinburgh. I'm actually rather interested in everything you've had to say, and thank you all for your work and your publications, Professor Dresser especially. It's been very informative. I wanted to kind of jump out at something that, Roz, you mentioned in your poetry, and Professor Horton, you definitely mentioned once, as slavery is a part of a larger system. And I find it very curious. Obviously, I'm not from around here, if you can tell by my accent and the way I look. But I was kind of curious about the broader question about a heritage of imperialism, of how imperialism, if we might actually give a name to perhaps that larger system. I know it's been mentioned on and off, but it seems like this is something that, as important as the conversation about slavery is, almost obscures the fact that it's like we zoom in the cameras so much that we fail to notice that there's this bigger system that seems to be obscured by that. Of course, the whole thing of obscuring Professor Dresser comes from the title of your book. And I wonder if the panel can say anything about that, whether it's to the audience or I'd like to meet all of you individually. I'm moving to Bristol in August for my field work. But I find this all very fascinating. And I think one of the things about this is that Salman Rushdie has a quote from the Satanic Verses where he says, or one of his characters says, the trouble with the English is that their history happened overseas, so that they don't know what it means. No offense to those of you that are English. I quite love you, and I love your country. But there's this assumption that it was over there, and there's an assumption that it was a long time ago, as a lot of you have mentioned in your comments. And I suppose I'm curious, again, to meet each of you individually, actually, about this. But these perceptions and this notion of, I'm kind of rambling here, this notion of the bigger system, if you will, and what might we say about that, and what might we say about that in relation to our conversation about slavery? Because when I look at Wills Tower and know that the University of Bristol was founded in 1909 with money from the Wills family, whose fortune was made in tobacco, and the Fry family, whose fortune is made in chocolate. Obviously, I'm a pipe smoker, cigar smoker, I'm also a tea drinker. All of these things come to our lives and are part of our social milieu. Yes, largely through slavery and the role that had in that, but that's also part of a wider imperial system. And so, yes. Sorry, I'll stop my rambling there. Thank you so much, sir.
Can I go?
Yes, just a quick one. Please don't think that I was sort of saying that the Colston should be still memorialized because he did good as well as being involved in the slave trade. What I'm saying is that history is messy, it's complicated, and to demonize people with red plaques or to polarize things into the good and the bad actually lets us all off the hook. Because it isn't just about class, it's about human decisions to exploit other humans. And for the slave trade afforded unprecedented wealth, the opportunity for a lot of poor people to get rich. And it wasn't just the wealthy merchants, although they were in control, and I take the point about that. And that needs to be addressed because it still affects us now, perhaps more than ever. But it's also about the human decisions that we all make about whether, if we're a shipbuilder or we're employed by a ship's captain or what have you, we all have to make those decisions about whether we collude with the oppression of other people. And I just would also like to say that the complicated notion of doing your research and getting your facts right actually is really important for understanding the presence and to have a more nuanced views, because you cannot correct, as Bob Marley said, if you don't know where you're coming from, you don't know where you're going to go, and you have to understand the past before you can move on to the present. And it might be a little bit boring to do the research, but it's the responsibility of people who do have the time and opportunity to do the research to make sure that the public commemoration, our understanding of the present day of the campaigns we want to do is historically well informed.
Okay. A gentleman?
Okay.
Yeah.
Can we,
Yeah.
Okay.
I'd be really interested to hear from the panel about what they think about slavery that's happening at the moment, and whether a fitting, I don't know if memorial is the right word, but whether there's something to be said about learning from the experiences of the history of our city, but using that to inform our contribution to the present day, and seeing if there's somewhere where we can get involved to take those experiences and turn them into something more positive and actually contribute to a pretty desperate situation for a lot of people that's still happening in the world today. Yes.
Thank you.
Okay.
The lady in the stripe here, that.
Hi, I'm a history teacher in a local school, and I think the contribution I'd like to make is just to reflect on how we actually teach our young people in this city about it, because if we're going to have a legacy of slavery, and we're going to think about slavery's role in the city, we have to educate our young people. And I think it's quite interesting to reflect that the way that traditionally it's been taught in schools is in a unit, and I think this relates to what you were saying, which was called Black Peoples of the Americas. So there was a real distance between the people that we're teaching, the young people that we're teaching, and what they felt. And it was very easy to just put it out there. And I think much more recently, teachers have started to look at this in a more local context. And I think that's where the history starts to make a real difference. So when you talk about Colston, when you talk about what you can see physically around the city, when you talk about the way in which our city has been built on the exploitation of the enslaved people, it becomes far more powerful. And I'd be really interested to hear from the panel, if we're talking about commemoration, what maybe the university could contribute towards the education of primary...
There are 2 universities.
Both, sorry. This university and UoB could contribute to the education of primary and secondary school children in the city, because they really are ready to engage with it. I know I've been teaching about the bus boycott as well, for example, and when you really start to bring it home to them about how it's changed their city, it makes a difference, and that's going to take us forward and make a real legacy and make people engage more really with that.
I'm Mark Hanson. I'm a lecturer in German history at this University of Bristol. Germany, of course, is a country which has its own dark history and its own demons, and so I've been particularly interested in the contours of this evening, which have talked on how we might memorialise slavery and think about the future of it in this city. And I would say I have nothing against having a big monument. That could be quite a good thing, but I'm quite taken thinking about what's happened in Berlin in the last 20 years or so, where after very many decades of debate about what to do for a Holocaust memorial, a very large, interesting installation was put in place, which has been a big magnet for lots of people, particularly tourists, but which I'm not quite sure Berliners themselves engage with very much. I think this is a slight danger. You put up a big memorial and it becomes a part of the furniture and you can walk past it and it's easily ignored. I think there is that danger about it. I think Germany has actually done a rather good job in coming to terms with its demons and it continues to do so, but I think it's not so much because of the difficult engagement with places or putting up memorials. And I'm particularly pleased to follow on from the last speaker, because what I think it's really been about and continues to be about is education. So I'm quite interested in the idea of a memory centre. I don't know what that would be, but that sounds like an interesting idea. But I think particularly the thing that this city should do is to ensure that this topic in all its facets and in all its controversies, which we've heard about this evening, is firmly embedded in the curriculum of our schools, our state schools and our private schools. I think we need some sort of a foundation to which the schools, business in the city, the two universities, the churches, other partners can play a part to found some sort of a foundation which can take this work into our schools, involve not only the children but also their families as well, and embed this change over the years and decades to come so that it becomes a lived part of this city.
I finished school very recently, not too long ago, and I have to say I learned hardly anything about slavery, literally very, very basic. If I wanted to learn about slavery, I had to go to talks like this, or I had to really do my own kind of research. And I think actually if we want to remember slavery, we have to teach it. We can't just have a museum and leave it somewhere and then people who are interested can go. We need to teach young people, all young people. So I really think that actually adding more about slavery or teaching young people more about slavery is how we will remember it and how, we can look back.
Let's make a comment about the topic for this evening. It's about legacy and remembrance or memory. In the same way you've got 100 years after the First World War, it's about remembering the past. I mean, so you can't just talk about today, and getting on with today. I think we learn from the past, and I think that the commemoration of the First World War, and it's going to go on for the next 4 years. One is remembering what went on wrong, what was wrong, or what was right. So therefore, in terms of remembering enslavement, it's important for young people to know that, especially black people, black youngsters. You see, because when there's no memory, then there's no history. And if there's no history, there's no identity. And in that particular case, then our young people wouldn't be able to know the past. I remember in 2007, John Prescott, who was the Deputy Prime Minister, he came down to London and he was saying that he came up to Bristol and he met lots of African Caribbean young people who didn't want to know about the subject of the slave trade. Now, when that's the situation in any place, it's a pity that one doesn't want to know about one's own heritage. And it has to be the way it's taught in the schools. And it really has to be addressed in a particular sensitive way in which young people, especially African people of African heritage, should be able to appreciate the history, and not that the history is presented in a way in which they are made to feel ashamed. And many, many young people are like that. That has to change. And in terms of how we remember the past, one has to realize that there are people, there are young people especially, whose heritage it is. So if it's enslavement, a lot of things happen to their ancestors. There are many things that they did. For example, I mentioned to you about the fighters like Busso and Sam Sharp. These were people who ought to be commemorated. These are abolitionists, but you don't hear about them as abolitionists, but they are, right? They are heroes in the sense that they attempted to break a system that they couldn't break, but eventually they took matters into their own hand. For example, Sam Sharp, he died, and his statement was, I'd rather die on this particular gallows than live in slavery. So they're heroes in that sense, and therefore any commemoration should look at both sides of the coin. What they did, what they didn't do. But what we shouldn't do is try to actually bury the history. And of course, with historians and archaeologists and others in that field, they're digging up information, more information each day, and they're able to help us to understand. A lot of things that are being done today is because of research. And for us to understand the history, because it's a joint heritage, it's joint. And look, I've been dealing with government departments on this. And when I said to them, I'm doing a history about abolition, they said, well, we can't comment about slavery. We said, well, I'm not doing slavery, I'm doing abolition. I'm doing stories that led up to the emancipation of African people. And we've had no comments from government, right, until now. And I began this about 18 months ago. And I can show you letters that I've had from them. So it's coming from the top, if the top does not really appreciate the history. For example, I can tell you a letter I wrote to not to the Prime Minister, but it's a letter to the communities and local government people. And it's as though they're saying, well, look, this is not our history. I wish you the best. I wish you luck. That kind of nonsense is still going on. So once that's happening, we need to consider that it's not going that way. So therefore, communities have to come together and discuss it. Otherwise, we're going to be, moving backwards.
First of all, I'd like to congratulate you all for your patience. I think this is part of the process of memorializing what happened, remembering our history. History and heritage are constructed in the present. Which aspect of the past do we want to remember? And why do we want to remember it? The process of remembering the past, particularly of slavery, it's not to be restricted to the formal educational sector alone. Those of us who have come in here have taken something that we can take home. We have to begin at the level of the families, discuss it at home with our children. Let us begin to understand, question ourselves, who do we think we are? Why is society the way it is today? It is good to ventilate. And so it's also good to have references about the waywardness of the past. We can leave some monuments that we already have in situ, not to change them, not to change names, but those will be reference points that what happened should no longer happen. The media has to be actively engaged in the discussion. Then in this formal sector, which is the formal educational sector, we need to have exchanges. It will be good for schools to organize excursion programs into communities of Africans. Whites going into African communities and vice versa, so we can understand and appreciate each other. Questions have been asked, comments have been made about slavery in the present. Yes, we can talk about the abolition of slavery, but slavery is still ongoing. We are in the era of the new slavery. As a result of deprivation, many people are still downtrodden. Many human beings, especially descendants of enslaved people, are still being discriminated against, and something which is known to many of us. People have stereotypes about Africans or peoples of African origin. How do we ensure we live over and above that? It will come only when we continue the discussion and have clear understanding of what happened. And it not come just by reading today or having this conference. This is the beginning of a good process in this city, and I would encourage you all to make it work. And anytime you hear of such a forum, encourage many more people to attend. That's the only way we can heal and deal with our past for the betterment of the present. Thank you.
To say the last word. Our artist was.
I was only thinking about two things, really. Something Eston was saying, really, about identity for the city of Bristol. What is it and how we move forward? Obviously, as a writer and artist, I'm concerned, because that's what we use to sell Bristol outside of the city, in London and elsewhere. The man at the front was talking about the globalization and link. I think, and certainly when I was kind of preparing, I suddenly realized that's what it is. It's this triangle that's perpetually in our midst. And what are the goods and what are the people that are moving, and netted up, and who are becoming quite dehumanized, really. I mean, you kind of think of the migration of people, economic, unpapered people, and the lives they lead. They're all part of the economy. Whether we have Cameron and the rest of the different political parties coming up with strong words on migration, the actual reality, it's kind of undocumented, that cheap labour, that's cheap and expendable.
I think we've extended our enthusiasm for too long now. So thank you very much, Arthur, for doing a splendid job coming up from London to sharing, and for Kojo for coming all the way from Ghana, and for Cameron for coming all the way from America, and Madge all the way from the other university.